when you're actually discussing all these things while also ingesting the beverage, right?
I know that you, as the advisor of the Institute, you take that role very, very seriously.
There's so many patents also on ayahuasca. So I think about more than 500 different patents.
For me, it was like, wow, this is way more complicated. It's not a one size fits all silver bullet type of solution. What benefits, shall we say, and of drinking the brew, the tea, the beverage, while having a serious discussion of something that really matters?
What are those patents trying to do? And what does it mean for indigenous sovereignty and ethics? Listen to the full podcast.
What if the most sophisticated diplomatic process on the planet isn't happening at the UN, but in the Amazon jungle, where indigenous leaders debate complex global issues while drinking ayahuasca together? My guest today has witnessed both. Meeus is a Belgian human rights lawyer who's worked at the UN High Commissioner's Office for Human Rights, advised interfaith rainforest initiative across 5 countries. He spent at least 6 years building bridges between indigenous spiritual leaders and global institutions. He speaks 5 languages, has attended 4 indigenous ayahuasca conferences, and has sat in rooms with some of the most influential religious and spiritual leaders on the planet. In this conversation, Ben breaks down what he observed across decades of working with world-class spiritual leaders, the common traits that separate the ones who command natural authority from everyone else. He explains how indigenous communities achieve consensus on issues so complex that would paralyze Western war-rooms. And he articulates the tension every high performer faces when called to something bigger. If you've ever wondered what real spiritual leadership looks like, the actual mechanics of how these leaders think, decide, and navigate impossible complexity, this conversation delivers. Please enjoy my conversation with Ben Meeus. So it's been roughly about a month since we came back from the 5th Ayahuasca Conference, and you've been there, I believe, 4 times. And what were some of the top takeaways you got from the 5th Ayahuasca Conference?
Yeah, it's indeed my 4th participation. Again, I think worth recalling that the first one I participated in was in 2018 at the Puyanawa village. Second and the third and the 4th Indigenous Ayahuasca Conference were at the Renkata Institute, for which I'm an advisor. And then the 5th one now was at the sacred village of the Yawanawa people. Just giving a bit of a timeline, because the first time I participated was 2018. The 5th one now was 2025. And for me, coming to your point of what main takeaways is just having seen the process of the discussions and how they've been evolving, how the thematics have evolved, how indigenous peoples, I don't know if your listeners get some information in advance or not, but there were over, I think in all the conferences combined, must have had over 25 to 30 different indigenous populations participate, not just from Brazil, over 30, but also from Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, even Mexico. There was a Native American representation as well from the United States, Canada, even Indonesia, Bali, Egypt. So some coming together of many different indigenous leaders, but specifically the ayahuasca spiritual leaders that have these millenary traditions. They come from the Amazon basin at large. And I think the 5th one, this 5th conference, just as the biggest takeaway point for me was just to see the maturity, the level of the sort of unity and commitment of those indigenous leaders to really tackle the questions of the common issues that they're facing head on and collaborate and look to understand each other better as well. It's not a given that indigenous communities from the Amazon all see eye to eye on these issues, have the same points of view. So those conferences exactly is bringing a lot of food for thought for them, but also just it allows them to recognize how each community, each tribe, each leader has been analyzing and dealing with the consequences and impacts, I guess, of the globalization of ayahuasca mostly, but also the things that they've been seeing, not just in their own territories within the Amazon, but also outside as they get the opportunity to travel outside, not just within Brazil or within different countries in South America, but also to the United States, to the European Union, to Africa, to Russia, different places. And so point number one, a main takeaway for me was really just a high level of maturity in the discussions and the sort of actions and recommendations that they want to be putting forward to the global. Yeah, that's something you can read also in the declaration of the Fifth Indigenous Ayahuasca Conference. There's many points that have been touched. I think besides that, as an overarching point, I think more concretely, and actually a sort of a consequence of that unity and maturity of discussions is also the commitment that they've made during the conference to set up a council of indigenous spiritual leaders. So they would be formally, structurally, institutionally finding a sort of a platform of uniting and bringing together the spiritual leadership of their different communities that use ayahuasca traditionally to have a platform to be able to position themselves, to be able to create, which was one of the outcomes as well, to create a code of ethics. I think clearly, and I think you've seen that as well, there's so many of the difficulties that are being discussed and seen by the indigenous leadership is somewhat enshrined in the realm of ethics and also of law. So legal and ethical issues have been very prominent in the discussions, and it goes to the fact that there's a huge amount of commercialization of ayahuasca. There's quite a lot of examples that have been raised about the cultural appropriation, not just of the medicine, but also of their cultural artifacts or cultural expressions like songs and music and etc. And then even of their own indigenous names or the names of their tribes to other places and things like that. Besides also just more overarching issues of a high rising level of criminalization and legal procedures and issues around ayahuasca being stopped at borders, in airports, in houses, etc., in different legal realms, be it in the United States, be it in the European Union, or be it in Central to South America. A lot of examples of legal cases. And then, yeah, one other point was quite an eye-opener, I think, during the conference was the fact that there's so many patents also on ayahuasca. So I think about more than 500 different patents that have been identified by a legal team of analysts that have worked with Yorenka, Tasoretsi, the Institute, to try and understand what's going on. And of those 500, there's certain patents that are already going into a realm of sort of product development around ayahuasca, be it the development of pills, development of, I think there was something like what they make now, cigarettes, like artificial smoke creator, a vapor, an ayahuasca vape, and things like that. But quite an interesting and concerning aspect there of just the pharmaceuticalization of ayahuasca, and then enters into certain realms and processes where ayahuasca, putting it into a pill to transform it into something that's usable within a therapeutic context, also becomes quite, how to say, yeah, quite the topic of discussion when it comes to cultural appropriation, and also the benefit sharing that should be happening with indigenous peoples when genetic resources are used from their traditions for the development of certain drugs or tools. And then, of course, also the fact that there needs to be respect for free prior informed consultation, FPIC, constitutionally and internationally enshrined human rights obligation that pharmaceutical companies and others would have when it comes to developing such drugs, and that have not been happening in the right ways. So again, human rights issues, ethical issues, I think all around. So main takeaway is just the indigenous peoples have matured their discussions around that. The information that they've been able to gather and discuss has been top notch, I think. And so they've been able to really, come to a next level in terms of their discussions and their actions that can be taken to really look for respect and valuing of not just their voices, but also their rights and their position as the traditional guardians of the knowledge related to this plant medicine.
Personally, for me, my biggest takeaway was my understanding, my worldview around ayahuasca was mostly from a consumer aspect of it. and all of behind the scenes in cultural appropriation, the implication as it pertains to law and patenting and commercialization and all of these other very complicated issues I just never was in front of my mind. And then for me, it was like, wow, this is way more complicated. It's not a one size fits all silver bullet type of solution to solve it. And that was very educational for me, right? It's very much, I've never been to a UN conference, but I would assume that's kind of, it felt to me very much like a UN conference. You have the translators, you have multiple nations represented talking about big issues and policy stuff. Is that very similar or very different?
And in fact, it is, and I would say it's almost next level. I think in terms
It's
of
next level, is
um,
above. All right.
I find it so it's a different type of diplomacy when you're actually discussing all these things while also ingesting the beverage,
Mhm.
right? During the conference, you actually drink ayahuasca as well. You're not obliged to do that, but it's open to do. And I find it, yeah, very enriching in the way that you perceive and are able to follow the discussions. As also, you're not just talking about the beverage, but you're actually just ingesting it, and that allows for better conversations to flow, I think, as well, and more respectful engagement on the topic. But also, the it changes the diplomatic talking field. Let's say it's a whole another level of diplomacy in my eyes.
So actually, if you don't mind double clicking on that a little bit, because let's say before the conference, I was just intrigued. I was like, how do the people actually have conversations drinking ayahuasca? And then during the conference, and I saw how it's done, and then we have people on the panel repeatedly remind people that, hey, you're not here to drink to get to a mystical state. You're here to drink to expand your perceptivity, sensitivity, so you can just essentially be more open-minded to really hear about not only the issues at hand, what's being said, but also the energy of the room, so to speak. And now my opinion is I love that. And I think all meetings should be conducted with ayahuasca, in my opinion. But I'm curious, from your perspective, because you've done that 4 times, and what benefits, shall we say, and of drinking the brew, the tea, the beverage, while having a serious discussion of something that really matters.
I think the answer is a bit in the question, right? It's exactly because it's a serious topic that really matters, and the fact and the use of ayahuasca in itself is a serious topic that really matters. So everything around it matters and is serious. I think in the way, at least, maybe to address that question is I feel that in any case, when you ingest ayahuasca, you're bound to understand things a bit more deeply. You're bound to listen more than you would speak. You're bound to look more than you would distract or so your level of concentration and perception and humility, I think, also is just strengthened in the process. I think it's important, especially also for non-Indigenous peoples that participate there. I'm not sure, again, if the listeners would be aware, but you sign a form as well in advance of participation that as a non-Indigenous person, you are there to listen and not speak unless called upon to speak, etc., which I think is very important too when at an Indigenous Ayahuasca conference. But I speak from a non-Indigenous perspective in having gone to these conferences and learning along the way is just the ingestion of the beverage as you speak adds to, yeah, just a deeper understanding of the amount of respect that space merits and needs to be warranted when you discuss these things, especially the use of ayahuasca for and Indigenous peoples, these communities. It's such a sacred, central element for their spiritual, cultural, personal, collective, territorial, environmental development. It's all connected. Like their identity as an Indigenous peoples is so intrinsically connected to their spiritual practices, and ayahuasca is such a central element to that. That truly, it's. I don't know if it's a good comparison to make, but it's as if we were in America is a predominantly Christian country. We were going to a study group or a conference to discuss the Bible and the Word of Jesus, for example. It'll be perhaps a bit counter spiritual or sacrilegious to just stand up and do whatever, say whatever you want. It's good to listen. It's good to be respectful when you're talking about what is within the utmost sacred tenets and practices of these Indigenous peoples. And ayahuasca is definitely within that category and realm of just be sacred. And the more you learn, the more you listen, the more you feel, the more you pray and concentrate and understand these leaders as how they navigate the world, the complexities they're dealing with, the care, the history also they carry to ensure that their people thrive and can develop in the right ways is just nothing short of heroic in many cases, I believe. And yeah, in that sense, I think, again, coming to that question, the ingestion of ayahuasca while you have these discussions it's only natural for them as indigenous peoples to do that. And the more you engage with that, the more you can see that as well and how it adds a value to the just respectful dialogue and constructive dialogue that they're having about this
So
topic.
actually, as a follow-up, I was half joking about, hey, all business meetings should be done with ayahuasca like that. Half joking, but half serious, right?
Yes.
Do they drink ayahuasca and have serious conversations, perhaps about their own village or cultural whatever issues? Also drinking ayahuasca? Do you know of any? Or this is a very special occasion, only do that during ayahuasca conference, you don't do that otherwise?
No, it's definitely not unusual. I'm not sure within more sort of political inter inter-indigenous conferences, let's say, too sure. I haven't seen that happen, for example, that there would be ayahuasca consumption and a collective basis as discussions are going about. But
Mhm.
again, this is actually also, I think, something that's been developed. It's not the Indigenous Ayahuasca conferences, and the fact of drinking ayahuasca while these conferences is happening is also, to my understanding, something relatively new in the realm of Indigenous-led conferences. What's definitely not new is that these leaders, the spiritual leaders, who often carry sort of a double role of spiritual slash political leadership within their communities, they do carry their medicine wherever they go. So if they go to a be it at the UN, I've had participations there where indigenous leadership came, spoke, and before they speak, they drink a bit of their medicine. That's only normal. That's their way of doing things. It's their way of channeling their energy, strengthening their spirit before they speak in an important setting to ensure that, again, that their word is aligned with their spirit, basically. So definitely not unusual that would happen, but the collective use, the sort of everyone drinking ayahuasca, talking about ayahuasca, I think is quite unique to the Indigenous Ayahuasca Conference.
Let's zoom out for a second because you actually have had a really interesting career path where you actually have worked with many different faith, spiritual leaders in the world. Maybe you can share with some of the people that you work with, and then I'll ask my follow-up question after that.
Right. Yeah, yeah. It's I guess maybe it requires a bit of a back step to explain my history of how I got there. Is that
Sure.
thing? Because we were talking, the conversation started about ayahuasca and spiritual leadership. I think quite central to my personal story and history is also that as of my 16 years old, I got to engage and learn about ayahuasca. So since my 16, I've been drinking and participating in rituals and ceremonies in different continents, Europe, the United States, Brazil, in many different settings. But that had become and still is a very central guiding element in my personal journey and personal development through life, spiritual development as well, mainly, I believe. And it sparked a real interest when I was 16. It helped me just immensely to work through some of the things I was dealing with, and it sparked my interest in trying to understand, okay, divinity is real, if God is real, if there is this transcendental overarching consciousness that reigns over our life as human beings, our life, all life on earth, etc., then still us with light and love and harmony and peace, etc. I want to maybe learn more about where that comes from or which traditions have been developing the intelligence and understanding and study of what that entails and where that comes from and how that relates to us as human beings. And so at that same time, I started developing an interest to study human rights. I was traveling also in Brazil. I learned about minority issues, a lot of structural racism. I was blown away backpacking in Brazil. Then I understood privileged Flemish white boy from Belgium. And it's still the deep desire for me to also study human rights. Again, after an ayahuasca ceremony, I called my parents in Belgium and said, please subscribe me to law school. That was in August, September. University was starting. So I went back and started studying
Wait,
law.
wait, what did you go from I'm interested in helping human rights to law? How did you make that jump?
My grandfather has been quite of a guiding person in my life to that end when it comes to making decisions on where to take things. He always pitched law to me. It's something that will bring you places and open as much doors as you can for you. It made sense. I followed his advice and I'm really happy I did. I studied just a bachelor's in law first and then did international and European law. And it was the perfect sort of study through which to also analyze and try to learn a bit more about the problems that we're facing at a global scale. Specifically, my jam was natural resource extraction and the global South and North relationships. And at the time at law school, I wrote my first thesis on the transnational human rights obligations of the European Union when signing free trade agreements. So it's like when you do trade basically with other continents, what is to say that human rights will prevail over economic interests when there's serious violations happening? Very sobering thesis. That was my first sort of interest in human rights, was exactly that sort of natural resource extraction, displacement of minorities and indigenous peoples and disadvantaged communities, threats, violations of human rights, killings, etc. And then then studied another master's in Latin American studies, continued focusing on that. Plus, and this is something we talk about later or not, but my second master thesis, I wrote about the internationalization of the religious use of ayahuasca. And then afterwards worked a bit as lawyer in Brussels for migration. Then got invited to participate in a 6-month internship at the UN High Commissioner's Office for Human Rights.
Mm.
There was basically accepted to support the work of the Indigenous Peoples and Minority Division. So I started with Indigenous peoples' participation in the UN system and training of Indigenous peoples on human rights and the UN system, etc., and how they can advocate for their rights, what kind of knowledge they can bring back to their communities to advocate, and so on. After that, there's a bit of a timeline shift, but after that, I did some additional, that was 2018, did some additional hearing, which started with my participation in the second Indigenous Ayahuasca Conference, and then helped Benki Bianco Ashanika, who you've met, the president of the Orenkata Sorensi Institute. At that time, I helped him basically develop the concept note of what the institute could look like. And we started working to set it up and make it a reality, which is not so hard with someone like Benki because I think he's what they call a manifester and he does it. So it was a real honor to help and support that project. And then I was traveling with him upon invitation in 2018 still, I think in November, to Canada, Toronto, where he was asked to participate in the Parliament of the World's Religions. And they had, through the work of also someone called Benjamin Mudge, who negotiated basically a space at the plenary session, so in front of thousands of religious leaders from all over the world, an overview and a presentation session about indigenous ayahuasca cultures. And Benki was invited to represent Brazil. There was a Shipibo leader from Peru. There was also the UMIC, who you've met, from Colombia, the Union of Indigenous Medicine Men from the Colombian Amazon. And that was amazing, of course, to witness that moment. And that's during that time, Benki was also invited to participate in a side event from the UN Environment Program, where they were presenting the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative. And so I guess it's a bit of a long contour to get to your questions. It's an initiative I've worked for the past 5 years dedicatedly. The last year I've been accompanying it, but not working directly for it. So last 6 years basically has been under development. And it's a program that's been developed with support of the Norwegian government and through the UN Environment Program, where I was in a position of what they called a country liaison officer. In the process of my personal journey there, and also the virtue of being Belgian, we learn quite a bit of languages. So I speak Flemish is my native language. Then there's French and English, as well as Portuguese and Spanish. So I speak 5 languages, and the UN Environment Program instrumentalized that to ensure I could be a country liaison officer in different time zones. So on a daily basis, I was liaising teams in Brazil, Colombia, Peru, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Indonesia, including with travels there and launch events. where we basically set up country programs, doing inception missions first, having a bunch of meetings with representatives of the main religious institutions in each of these countries. So we basically, within Brazil, for example, where you were, we'd work with the Catholic Church, evangelical associations, other Christian associations, the Muslim associations, the Jewish associations, etc., building a national advisory council, and then bringing them together with indigenous peoples organizations. In Brazil, again, just as an example, would be APIB and COIAB, so national umbrella organizations that represent the majority of indigenous peoples organizations in the country. And we bring them together also with scientists and academics, sometimes the UN, etc., basically advocate for more awareness, giving religious leaders and communities the tools to also raise awareness with their constituents about basically the tropical deforestation crisis, about the importance of the Amazon rainforests or the Congo Basin or Southeast Asian forests, and how they can find within their religious scriptures the basis for their religious commitments towards care for creation, and how that relates also to the importance of respecting indigenous people's rights, etc. So at the country level, to respond to your questions, met with, of course, a series of religious leadership, mainly the ones responsible for overseeing collective institutions of different religions. And then at the international level, been working with different also interfaith and faith organizations, be it of the world's religions, was part of the founding organization of the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, for example. Religions for Peace, as where I was heavily involved in liaison as well in New York when I was living there for about 5 years. Green Faith, the World Council of Churches. We can keep naming.
Yeah. Okay.
Just religion became a lot more.
So there's a lot, right? So you've worked with a lot of people. Basically, that's thank you for making the point that I was trying to get at. So here's a follow-up question. Since you met with so many world leaders in faith and spirituality and different regions of the world, what is the common denominator that you recognize, that you see, just that you sense, that you observe?
In what sense?
Just something that's, for example, right? Let's say if you're a Hollywood star, and the common denominator is the it factor, as an example. I'm just making stuff up. So what is a it factor for these type of religious leaders?
I think there's different it's depending on who you speak to. I've had the privilege of, there's just been some people that I've had the privilege of meeting in those, in different contexts internationally in the countries itself during missions. There's an it factor definitely in terms of calmness. These are very calm people. They are extremely responsible, but they carried it in a light way. And yet, when they speak, it's as if they cut through paper. It's some of the leaders I've met, and especially the ones that I've been quite inspired by, it's just incredible to see what kind of a lens they see things through and how they're able to, cut through the bullshit of anything that might be floating in the room that doesn't get to the point of what needs to happen or what needs to get done, again, to the benefit of collectively of the people of the country in question. And so these are extremely responsible people as well, when they caring people, humanitarian people that, carry the flag of solidarity unwaveringly, and can be very skeptical of many things as well, but without a seeming shame about it that some might feel when opposing or raising their voices against certain things that are happening, including many things, there's continuous things that are happening around the world that might require some criticism and awareness raising about really doing. But religious leaders that I've met specifically in those fields that have the it factor, I guess that's what it comes down to for me. Kind, compassionate, extremely responsible, serious, light, and caring, sort of a natural demand of authority. It's not that they're asking for it, they just have it. And
yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. The reason why I asked you specifically that question, because not many people have met many world level spiritual leaders, and not to make them supernatural or anything, because that's the romantic notion of those people maybe the lores of who they are, how they came to being, but actually, tactically, when you're in their presence, what do you feel? So thanks for recapping that.
And maybe something to add is also usually those are also people that have gone to quite a series of things in life that amounted to quite episodes of having to deal with suffering. So these are people that have felt suffering in their lives usually as well. And another interesting factor is when religious leaders, and it's like any leader, a political leader or any kind of leadership that starts to necessitate institutionalization and organization around it and structure and hierarchy, etc. The moment that that's there, it's always a bit complicated. There's a lot happening underneath and a lot of.
Wait, you lost me. Last sentence, one more time. What did you just say?
I was just saying that when you look at leadership, just taking the most straightforward example, but there's so many others. Pope Francis, for example, you have an entire institutional and organizational framework around that with a hierarchy and lots of politics that affect the way that leader can also navigate or say things or not say things or etc. So that's something that you see a lot with at least leaders that have a strong institutional responsibility, as they have to deal with once the door closes and they're out of the speech ceremony. There's usually a lot happening in the back door. That's it's a common denominator as well.
So what I'm hearing you say, let me just recap: kind, compassion, and caring, often coming from a place of having had suffering in the past. Knowing, you didn't say this word, but morality, very strong identity or idea of what's right or wrong, and then they're not afraid to speak out against something, even when it's perhaps unpopular. And also, again, you didn't say this, but this is kind of what I'm gathering from between the words, is discernment. You can cut through the bullshit. Like, here's all kinds of stuff, and then just discern. Here's the thing that I'm going to say that's going to pierce the whatever bullshit there is. Is that an accurate recap? Again, I kind of put a few different words in your
Very-
in your mouth, but
Well, absolutely, that's correct. That's correct. And then
beautiful.
sometimes, depending on the leader, again, you'll see that some might apply a level of diplomacy by not saying the thing that needs addressing directly, and they might go around it, but get to the same point in the end. It depends. Some leaders are extremely straightforward, cut through the bullshit, even if it hurts someone's ego or personality. There's other leaders, depending on the context and situation, also that just need to be more diplomatic, depending on again on the stage and the people involved and the issue at hand.
Yeah. Speaking to their discernment. Last thing you also said is their calmness, their peace, in spite of whatever environmentally chaotic type of things happening as well. That's great. To me, they don't have to be spiritual leaders. This is just this traits of effective leaders. So that's great. Beautiful. Okay. Well, let's zoom in on diplomacy a little bit, because one of the things I saw during the ayahuasca conference, obviously there's many different layers. I can only see so much because I'm not a shaman, a facilitator, an elder in their tradition. So I'm sure they can sense things that's even more subtle than what I saw and sense personally. And it was really interesting to see how they reconcile differences of opinions. Since you've been there 4 times, since you've been around these type of leaders many a times, I'm curious to know if you can speak a little bit about, how they reconcile their differences that you have observed, that perhaps the viewer, myself, we can learn from. How do you diplomatically, come to a consensus or lead in spite of, many people disagreeing with you. Curious to know your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, usually when diplomacy applies, it means you're already in a process that has a certain direction, right? So when you're talking about the Indigenous Ayahuasca conferences, for example, we are looking at pretty heavy issues and themes. One of them being the one that I've been most involved in, for example, is the internationalization of the use of ayahuasca. We see many groups, many sort of neo-shamanic or therapeutic or spiritual type of groups offering diets or ceremonies or even selling on the internet or things like that for high prices. And the indigenous peoples often don't even come into the picture. What they are concerned about, of course, is that when indigenous peoples travel, as just to explain the issue set that can afterwards maybe respond to the question of diplomacy, it's when they travel, they also our international legal system and also the national legal systems of the places that they would travel towards almost automatically trigger them into the paradigm or category, either an international drug trafficker when an indigenous leader would travel with its medicine to the European Union or the United States, necessarily legally protected. They often don't speak the language of the places they go to. They have to trust the persons that have invited them, that they would be treated in the ways that they need to be treated as cultural and spiritual representatives of their peoples. And that, as we've seen also during that conference, leads and has led to some issues in the past, including imprisonment, quite moments in customs areas, in airports where they're treated just horrifically, with definitely some racist connotations related to their treatments, etc. They then also internally discuss these things, and they see, for example, look, we have already this issue of ayahuasca being under such a difficult light when we travel with it. We have to be very careful in terms of how we travel, how we present it, how we speak about this, to ensure that, again, that they, whatever happens, that they can count on, even in later stages, the protection of indigenous rights that they hold as spiritual and political leaders of their people. Imagine that they would also want to travel, for example, with Kambo or other indigenous medicine that is also strange to the legal system that we have, or even non-indigenous medicine or plants, or be it cannabis or something else. I'm not saying that they would do that, but I'm just saying these are things that, as indigenous leaders that are leading those processes of the conference, get very strong opinions about the fact that they need to be extremely ethical, extremely clean, extremely well organized and represented also by the people that are inviting you, to ensure that you can speak to justice or the judicial authorities, etc., in ways that are coherent, that respond to the legal and ethical question marks that the legal systems will have for you. And in the conferences, there's been a lot of discussions about that, differences of opinion as well. And again, I think that to try and respond to your question about diplomacy, it's tough, because when you see some of the differences of opinion, it requires sometimes a hard fist to be able to say, look, the ethics of this question are undeniably so, and may feel offended or not. And at least from what I've seen with the Indigenous Ayahuasca conferences, they've been always, every indigenous tribe that's been represented, no matter the difficulty that they've been having, they've always come back to the table, no matter if they felt offended or not, or that differences of opinion, etc. They always came back to the table to keep the discussions going. I think that has to do with the fact that, again, like the diplomacy that's being applied there is really just, if one tribe would offend the other and you know that they have historic issues with each other, then maybe if there is someone else from another tribe that has a better relationship, that's better positioned to go and say to the person that felt offended, well, it's actually understand you, understand him, try to walk to the middle, come back, and let's keep discussing, because again, this is important. It's the only space that we have to do this. We have to move forward. We have to create. This is keeping the eye on the ball, basically, how important it is in this case to have a unified way of organizing yourself and responding to so much difficult, that it's quite overwhelming when you think how indigenous communities in the Amazon are so affected by the globalization of ayahuasca. They don't have the luxury of going off on their own and just saying whatever. They have to be together in order to really make an impact and generate the benefits that they need to be generating for themselves, and the respect for their rights, etc., that need to be generated. So I think there's that. Plus, one thing that I find important to say is that the underlying an underlying current that's also making the fact that they feel that there's such a unity with these people as they discuss it, besides the fact that they're just extremely respectable leaders and discussing, of course, very central, important topics to their spirituality and culture. It's also simply the fact that they are witnessing, they are feeling the effects of global climate change on the ground. Like rivers are dying out, fish are dying out, trees are disappearing, certain plant species, animal species. They are they're literally at the front line of climate change consequences that are being felt in the skin by them. So it's not a distant reality. They know it's there, they feel it, and they also know that they're in a position within an ecosystem that's so crucial for humanity that they need to keep their culture and their spirituality strong in order to be able to sustain their territorial integrity as well.
So what I saw was there were a lot of opinions from different tribes, different leaders, different representatives. And then it just got to here's our consensus, right? So I kind of saw the before and a little bit of the during, but I didn't really see, for example, like a Senate would vote. Okay, you got majority, super majority, then you'll pass a bill, kind of a, a
Mhm.
formalized process like that. Again, not an expert in indigenous or even global relationships, things like that. So maybe you can speak to someone like me who's uninformed about how those things are typically done.
You said it. That's exactly how the process was for you. You've been there when they were constructing the declaration, for example. It's only consensual agreements pass the bill. So
Mm,
when there's a disagreement and even just one person in the room that says no, it does not end up on the final declaration.
wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Mm. Well, do you think, again, you're the global relationship expert here, right? Just between the two of us, is that what you've seen that's the most effective to move things forward?
I think it's the way it has to be if you proceed and move things forward. It depends. When you're looking at a collective effort like this of the Indigenous
Mm,
Conference and you want to put out collective statements towards the world and
mm,
of its magnitude of thematics that they're dealing with and discussing, then it has to be consensual. You can't just dismiss someone's opinion and say we're going to put this anyway, and then put the name of their people anyway on the declaration, and because
mm. It doesn't work. Yeah.
they don't disagree that's not ethical. Again, if we're talking about ethics, it has fully aligned with what they preach, and that's again unity. And again, the declaration says it all. So I'd advise and recommend people to read it. But then there's
Yeah.
of course things that can move forward a bit, at least discussions and explorations that don't necessarily, there's things that we need to be doing also with the Institute, for example, to try and fish for ideas and possibilities as we're observing the difficulties that they're discussing. One of those, is, for example, is observations and explorations that have been happening to understand the legal realm in the United States where you are, and understanding the religious freedom aspects of international transportation and use of ayahuasca within the United States. There's clear precedents for, again, when talking about ayahuasca, I'm not sure how your listeners might be informed about that, but there's been a development in Brazil of not just indigenous ayahuasca use as the root of where ayahuasca comes from, but as history developed, there's been also the development of what I guess we generically call ayahuasca religions. And those are semi-structured Christian, Afro-Indigenous, plus coming together in a setting of congregation of what they call then a sacrament, which would be the ayahuasca, within a really particularly culturally developed setting that is considered a religious setting. And so it's been developed since the early 1900s. One of them is called the Daime, another is called União do UDV, another one is called Barquinha. And the Daime and UDV, particular, have expanded internationally much before the indigenous started to even travel outside of their territories. And so within the United States, for example, there's already legal precedents before the Supreme Court for the religious freedom, which is also based on religious freedom struggle that was made by my understanding, limited understanding so far, the Native American people in the United States with regards to the Native American church for the use of peyote, which is a similar comparable context of the sacramental or entheogenic sacred use of a plant medicine within spiritual, traditional, cultural context. So the Supreme Court has liberated the religious use under the Religious Freedom Act, and I think it's the Second Amendment or first, it's even the First Amendment, I think, of religious freedom in the United States. And so similarly, the Daime, União do Vegetal, they have received federal exemption within the United States for the religious use of ayahuasca, meaning they can import, use ayahuasca in a sacred and safe and controlled setting where they receive ayahuasca, they write down how much, they keep it safe, they use it for specific ceremonial purposes, etc. The DEA provides an exemption, so whenever it gets into the country, they know, they get the papers, they see it, boom, passes, and etc. So basically, what we've been exploring already in terms of discussions with lawyers as well that have been involved in those Supreme Court processes is to understand how could this be established for Indigenous leaders. Imagine, again, then this is on the imaginatory field still, but imagine the fifth Indigenous Ayahuasca Conference now coming with the final recommendation and action, endorsed in action by everyone, to create a council of Indigenous spiritual leaders. What if this council could become the guiding body of a center in the United States that receives religious freedom exemption and can actually administer ayahuasca to people in ways that are fully in coherence with all the ethical and public safety and health standards in the United States, while fully respecting the autonomy, decision-making, cultural integrity, and sacredness that these Indigenous leaders apply within the context that they serve and use ayahuasca. Those are questions that we're asking ourselves. There seem to be potential clear pathways to do that. And I forgot the question.
It's okay. It's okay. I'm actually, this is a good segue to my next question, though. I remember vividly there was an elder from Peru. He says, if we've been talking for 8 years, this is year number 8, fifth conference. When are we going to do something about it? I want to treat this with sensitivity and really honor how customarily is made. So take it as such, right? This is really a question of ignorance.
Right.
So there's a cost of, this slow consensus-based deliberation to honor traditions as time and effort to that Peruvian elder's frustration, right? He was frustrated about when am I going to do something about it? And then on the flip side, the Westerners, the entrepreneur types, they just make quick decisions, knowing that it's going to, upset certain people to keep the momentum and seize opportunities. Hence, to your earlier point about the establishment of these DEA exemptions with EDV and those other places. They're non-indigenous. They're basically West. I don't know, but they move faster. Is my point.
Non-indigenous, yeah.
Yeah. So from your experience in both worlds, obviously a Westerner, you've been deeply involved with indigenous people. Where is that balance where we respect and incorporate honoring traditions at the same time moving at a pace that that meets the urgency of the environmental degradation, the internationalization of ayahuasca, all the things that you mentioned? How can we basically move a little faster?
Well, man, I'm asking myself that question every day. So in terms of providing an answer, I don't know, but I can provide further reflections on the reflections that you're mentioning, this, and maybe following the example I was highlighting of the establishment of a center in the United States. There are questions as well that we're asking, like the establishment of a center, in essence, is a legal entity that you can establish in a couple of days. How not potentially do that? Already have 1 or 2 or 3 key leadership, as you've seen in the 5th Indigenous Ayahuasca Conference, for example, nucleus of Indigenous tribes that have been really pushing since the beginning these conferences. And it's, see the Ashaninka, the Awanawa, and the Puyanawa as sort of the core triangle there. People that have really just put all the effort in there to keep making this happen. So what if these leaders, which are obviously at some point going to be part, when it's created, of the Council of Spiritual Indigenous Leaders that they want to establish, again, questions there, is it going to be first national? Is it already going to be regional? towards other countries, not just Brazil, but also Colombia, Peru, etc. There's that. How do we potentially already start the establishment of a center in the United States with a small group that can then open the tent as things develop with the Indigenous Ayahuasca Conference as well and the Council of Spiritual Leaders there. And so these are things that we want to, again, these are questions we're asking ourselves. We want to do this, and it has to be in a very consultative way because the last thing you want to have the impression that people looking as wide as me start to establish indigenous churches in the United States or without previous consultation or full awareness or understanding of the leadership on the ground. And these are things that I think need to be continuously asked, and adding also the urgency of this, where we will continue to ask these questions over the coming weeks and months, and fully recognizing it. It's not just about, for me, the two main elements are, again, we're dealing with a global climate change crisis, ecosystem destruction crisis, and a global mental health crisis with people looking for meaning, understanding, a way to get in touch with their senses, their emotions, their feelings, in ways they can process them. I strongly believe, and I mean, for me, it's not even a belief, it's a certainty. I've seen it too much to doubt it in any way, is that indigenous leadership and the indigenous use of ayahuasca and the, especially by the leadership that we've seen in this conference and the communities is such an essential and part of a solution. It's not the solution, but it's definitely part of it. And I think with that, it's only natural that people, and that's how I only personally also acted upon having the opportunity to heal and to understand and to integrate with ayahuasca, but naturally become an advocate for this story. For the past 15 years, I've been working on Amazon and rainforest protection, indigenous people's rights. I've learned to speak 3 additional languages, did 2 master degrees, and despite people still saying you would be doing drugs, you become an ally to those people. And I've seen this happen over and over again. People finding new and true meaning in their lives, feeling really about activating themselves, their talents, their expertise, their resources, whatever it may be, to help the overall mission of ecosystem restoration on the world. And then they, be it in their own country or in the Amazon with indigenous groups, they become just strong allies and supporters in ways that I think the world needs and that indigenous leaders deserve as well, in terms of allyship and support and friendship along the way. Because just despite all the struggles and difficulties that we may face as more Westerners in the US or Europe or others, I think the struggles, when you really connect with what these indigenous peoples and leaders and communities face and have been facing, and how they carry themselves through all of that, and how they look to contribute to the well-being of not just their communities, their forests, the world, it's extremely inspiring, and we have a lot to learn from him. It's just underlining the urgency there.
I'm definitely one of those people who was at first curious, then got tremendous benefits, enhanced my mental health, overcame my inner critic, and then now I live a life of soul alegria, and joy, and I'm becoming more of an ally to these indigenous elders because I've seen the work, right? Their sincerity, earnestness, their prowess, really helping people spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, etc. And hence why I'm on that journey with you, right? As an ally to this very unique solution to this type of crises of despair, right? Because people are looking for meaning, looking for purpose. And actually, you don't know this, but the start of the Noble Warrior podcast was also thanks to ayahuasca as well, right? Without ayahuasca, this podcast wouldn't have existed. So many levels to thank, to show gratitude to what ayahuasca has done for me and my life. Everything you said, I'm definitely a case study right there.
But I mean, if I may ask, since we're having a conversation, right? I can ask questions.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, go ahead.
What made you start the podcast, like ayahuasca related, that start?
Well, it was 2018 that I went to Burning Man, and then I don't know if you've ever been to Burning Man, but there's a open space called a playa, essentially, right? And playa to me is a microcosm of society. And then there was a Mongolian warrior 4 stories high right there. And then I was spending a lot of time with Mongolian warrior statues over there. And then it came to me, I believe in masculine values, responsibility, sacrifice, discipline, this type of masculine values. And I've been looking for a place that a source, some kind of podcast or books or people to have these type of conversations that fosters, what I'm interested in, which is on the entrepreneur side as well as the spiritual side, right? So if you think about Venn diagram, those are the overlap that I was interested in, but there wasn't a place. And since I'm a entrepreneur, I'm a creator, I said, fuck it, I'll start. Let me just do that.
Yeah.
But there's definitely in the beginning a series of, am I the person? Who am I to say I'm going to start something? There are a lot of doubts, insecurity. And again, thanks to drinking ayahuasca, just slowly shedding away all the different layers and the constructs, the doubts and all these things. And here we are 7 years later, we're still going.
Amazing. Awesome.
Yeah.
I love that. And it was such a pleasure to meet you. And now fiance, right? And
Correct. All right.
in the Amazon, I think it was last August,
Yep.
right? Yeah.
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 Yeah. It seems like a lifetime ago, but that was my first time in the Amazon jungle. And then who knew
No,
6 months later I was going to be back so soon.
now
So
you're already a professional mosquito bites.
every time I go, I learn something new. So let me ask you this. This is something that I'm curious about because I am witnessing it. And you work closely with many prominent spiritual leaders and those who are often placed on a pedestal by their devotees, followers, etc. Right? And obviously, we're all human, and inevitably mistakes are made, and we all have our human side and so forth. And when those mistakes come to light, some devotees become disillusioned or walk away or being angry at these people that they put on the pedestal in the first place. So I'm curious, from your vantage point, how do you navigate that tension, being objective, knowing that they're human, but still hold and hold these people to account, yet still provide support and respect that they also deserve? How do you walk that line?
It's a really good question. I think that's whenever people engage with spiritual communities or ceremonial contexts and so on, you inevitably start to have to ask yourself those types of questions at some point, almost inevitably. I've seen that a lot. Also in my personal story with drinking ayahuasca in the European Union, I've drank with many different churches and in Brazil and centers and in the US as well with thousands of people. When I was, maybe it's interesting to reflect back on that, when I was in my second master thesis writing about the internationalization of the religious use of ayahuasca, I started to notice within the processes, the legal processes where churches and ayahuasca practitioners were expelled by the federal police from Belgium, that we have a history of analyzing what in Belgium is legally defined as harmful sectarian organizations. And so there's all these principles and ethics that have been about the manipulation of be it, I mean, from a broader perspective, when you look at issues that arise by spiritual leaders within group settings, etc., it often has to do with money, power, or sex. And it's quite simple when you start analyzing the ethics and where certain lines are blunted or crossed. It always has to do with manipulation of the openness and sensitivity and mental, sometimes weakness or suggestibility of people to influence, that it ends up influencing their personal patrimony, their personal lives, their relationship with their family, their friends, etc., or their own bodies. And your question on whether to continue support or not, something.
Yeah, actually, let me correct. All right.
Right.
Let me be specific about my question. How do you navigate the tension of being objective and then at the same time still show them support and respect? Because there is a tension. Because there's for me, I'll just make it personal. For me, there's a series of recognition that these people are not enlightened, walk on water, live in harmony, soul agree all the time. They're human beings just like the rest of us. And then recognizing that, and at the same time still showing them the respect for this specialized skills or knowledge or tradition that they hold. So just the ability to hold both. That's
Right.
how I kind of come to be personally. I was just curious to know, having had since drinking at 16 and
Yeah. Yeah.
following these people for many decades now. So I'm curious to know, how do you think about it?
Yeah. So yeah, I guess just on your point, and I guess that it's definitely a specific question when it comes to indigenous leadership. I get much of the examples that I've seen relate to non-indigenous ayahuasca use, and I'm of the opinion that there's many situations and so on that in fact are borderline or just factually criminal. But when it comes to indigenous leadership, it's completely different. When you see the leader that we've met when we were together in last August is Kunkwa, is the youngest son of the chief that received us at the fifth Indigenous Ayahuasca Conference on his lands, which is just a bit more up the river. And Escunkwa, I think, is overseeing the biggest Yawanawa village of all the different Yawanawa villages that there are in the Yawanawa territory. There's, I think, about 15 villages, if I'm not mistaken. I can't even start to grasp my mind around all the different types of responsibilities and daily tasks and relationships that need to be maintained by someone who's not just a person leading the spiritual ceremonies, but who's the chief of an entire village, having to deal with family dynamics. Oh, this guy did this and I did that, and it's just constant attention required to deal with people. And then at the same time, having to think, okay, you got to continue developing your community. You've got projects going on. You're being asked left and right to do ceremonies or to fly here or to fly there. And I think the way I deal with it, at least, is first of all, I acknowledge that I have fit position or capacity to judge anyone that carries that level of responsibility. And I think when you see the level of integrity that people are applying, is Benki, Chief, others, it only merits support. But then specifically when entering in ceremony, and I think once you're in that sacred context and you drink the medicine, you receive it, and you know that they start their prayers. For me, the personal or opinions or things, it all becomes secondary. It's the moment you engage in a space like that, you're engaging with ancestral, sacred, spiritual energy and wisdom and guidance, including what's coming for the person, master of ceremony, let's say. They also need sometimes help and healing. And you wouldn't notice that while they're doing this work and helping sometimes group of over 100 people, they're going through things in their lives as well. They have their own personal things, but above all, when you're in a sacred ceremonial context and you drink ayahuasca, you really have to get out of the social mindset, the political mindset, the economic mindset, whatever is of the mundane or the more mundane sets that we can be in, and really go towards deeper and deeper in yourself and your own heart, your own interior, as profound as you can go to just keep, as you said, keep, how to say, undoing yourself from mindsets or veils that are covering, yeah, just the spiritual process is so profound. It's tough to even talk about, but it requires really almost singular attention to just yourself and your own process and your own energy. And to the extent that you can, of course, prayers for others and so on. And that's what makes it such a sacred thing as well, because you can always, even when you're in ceremony with someone who's chanting Bruce Springsteen while drinking ayahuasca, or I don't know, you can still have a sacred ceremony just for yourself, as how to just be there for yourself. But that is in no way an endorsement for non-indigenous led ceremonies with Bruce Springsteen music, but it's just to exemplify that I feel it's every time you drink even just a drop of ayahuasca within a context that you're with people who, throughout their own integrity and within their own process, want to self-improve, you have a huge opportunity to really go deeper. And that's always something to cherish and take care of. And yeah, I hope that responds to a certain extent to your question there.
This is a sensitive topic, right? So again, this is more of a reflection for me. Our mutual friend, he's very black and white about these type of things, right? He's okay. Is the person, has any kind of infraction around money, sex, or power? I won't work with him anymore. That's his black and white hard line right there. But he also has recognition to, right, these are human beings and they are what they are, and they also hold a very sacred post, whether
Yeah.
it's a page or the actual leaders of the tribe, etc. So when they hold the post, take it really seriously. That's what I got from having conversation with Rudy. So anyway, I was just more curious about your perspective since you need to navigate this about space of power and authorities and resource allocation, and then there's a lot of money being going about. So anyways, we don't have to air it. I was just more curious.
Yeah, no, it's a good curiosity to have and to reflect on Rudy's words. I tend to fully agree. When push comes to shove, at least for myself, I think there's lots of things happening and lots of people healing with ayahuasca, and yeah, to a certain extent, you can't really, you can't even judge it too much. I think you can make opinions based on what you're observing and so on. But like from a personal point of view, I only partake in ceremonies right now with leadership that I know is as fully aligned as you mentioned in Rudy's words. And I just don't step into any endorsement or any support for leaders or ceremonial practitioners that are not fully aware of what they're doing. And it's a tough thing to say because it would imply that I would know what needs to be done. And that's not the case either. But I do recognize that these indigenous leaders that have received this wisdom traditionally in their lineage, within the culture of their peoples for thousands of years, it's a good place to start and to endorse and to support. It's the place in my view. So that's, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. Let me ask you this. At what point did you realize that's the case for you? And while you think about that, let me give you a little context for me. When I first came in, it was through a Westerner or a neo shaman, shall we say, because I don't know the difference. Just it was a brand new world for me. So, person A from Israel, person B from Joshua Tree, person C from this name I never heard about from Brazil, the Amazon jungle. I don't know the difference. So therefore, I'm just gonna pick whichever was the most convenient, right? And then I got the experience, was beautiful, and then I leaned more and more towards the indigenous way, right? And nowadays I sit with indigenous people and because that's what I got the most benefit, shall we say. So I'm curious to know your journey because you started at 16 and you started drinking the Daime, if I recall correctly, and then you moved now all the way to just indigenous trusted leaders only. So,
I still go to the Daime as well.
oh, perfect, great, perfect. What were the pivotal moments in your ayahuasca journey from 16 to today that have you think differently about, okay, I'm gonna sit only with indigenous leaders or respected?
Yeah, this is a sensitive topic for me, at least. I know for the Daime community and in general, I think, but it's an important one in my story and directly related to your question. It's the only answer I can honestly give. For me, when I was studying the international expansion of the religious use of ayahuasca, I was doing a comparative legal thesis and I'll try to be short around the corners here to get to the point. But basically, the thing that happened was I started participating in various churches, and I felt like I got healed in the Daime to then afterwards just get sick again. And the reason was that from a strictly legal point of view, when I was studying, you get to the question of responsibility when hosting and administering ayahuasca to people within religious context, etc. Responsibility directly to ethical codes and standards that have been applied and established through, including in Brazil, for example, through many years, I think over 25 years of multidisciplinary research and discussions, that there's not supposed to be commercialization. There's not supposed to be use of other illegal substances within the ceremony, etc. It's exactly on that second point that things got really interesting for me, let's say, where I started to understand and recognize that there's actually many Daime churches using cannabis outside of their central use of ayahuasca, including within institutional settings of the Daime church that have been evolved and developed from Brazil. And so I realized that also in Brazil, even though it's not in line with national regulation, a part of the Daime church is also using cannabis before, during the pause, and after the ceremonies and so on. So I started putting myself in the position, in the shoes of if I were a Belgian judge, for example, I would ask in any case where there would be the joint use of ayahuasca with cannabis during ceremony, whether, first of all, if ayahuasca is essential for your religion, and yes or no. And then the second question is whether cannabis would be essential for your religion, yes or no. And when you ask that second question to people that use both ayahuasca and cannabis in ceremony, it is near to impossible to receive a coherent institutional answer. And I've started observing, of course, from a legal point of view, various issues that remained unresolved and started to even affect my health and mentally and physically in trying to make sense out of it. But also been seeing that, in my view, there's a certain level of addiction that comes in when it comes to the use of cannabis, which is not then just used in ceremonies, but then also during the days after, before, and everything in between. And yeah, that to me became a huge red flag, and a point where I was, okay, there's simply no compliance with core ethical standards that would allow for the safe internationalization of the religious use of ayahuasca without this issue being resolved. And there's clearly not an intention to resolve it. That's where I stepped out of most of my relationships with the Daime church. There's others that don't use and that have similar views and opinions, etc. But then even within the realm of churches, then there were others where I saw that there was an overly commercialization of ayahuasca, also a bit of creation of like guru type status where certain people would become like little VIPs within the church, and then the others want to be part of the VIP group, but if they're not, they have to figure it out, and it's a whole mental process for them, and it's weird and manipulative. And again, I'm talking about the bad apples. There's many good apples too, but unfortunately the bad apples end up being right in your face. And so for me, that was a process where I was really lucky and happy to get to know Benki and his work. And very short after we met, I invited him to when I was working at the High Commissioner's Office for Human Rights, invited him to the Human Rights Council to speak. And there's a video of that on YouTube. I think it's pretty amazing. His 17-minute speech in the Human Rights Council, he gave an opening prayer, and then it was on indigenous languages, cultural heritage, and traditional knowledge. So that was a turning point for me to just really focus on really supporting the indigenous cause. That's what it's all about. That's including the reason I think that ayahuasca is expanding so much. I think this is a core consequence that inevitably is taking shape, where the indigenous leadership is starting to receive its rightful place in policy discussions and stances on how and why this beverage should be made available to the public, and what's correct and what's not. And yeah, I think, again, I just want to emphasize there's many good Daime churches out there. There's, even within the indigenous peoples, I wouldn't say everyone's a saint. And so it's always just a matter of keeping your own discernment, your own heart and integrity always at the first place, knowing your intentions and how you go about, wanting to offer yourself to participate or support or come engage in a space. And yep, keeping your head on your shoulders and your heart on your sleeves a little bit, because you have to have a lot of compassion and solidarity in times like this. And yeah.
Beautiful. We talk a lot of different topics. Are there questions that you hope that I had asked, but I didn't ask?
I'm not sure. I think it's all good. One thing that I wanted to mention as well, if I may, was in the realm of this city that's happening with, I think, the discussions, so much opportunity, I think, and feel that's with us Westerners from different walks of life, different histories and backgrounds, but still there's so much that we can bring to this cause. There's so much we can get from it as well, I think. I think this idea of the church in the United States, church is a bad word, it's a center, but it would be religious freedom exemption. So in that sense, it's technically a church, but for indigenous peoples, it's a center for cultural healing and spirituality and education, etc. So I'm very excited about that, and the kind of another idea that we're exploring in terms of a vehicle for reciprocity that's been launched right now at the Indigenous Ayahuasca Conference is a local sort of indigenous-led fund as well. So we would want to put basically resources towards a fund that then the indigenous leadership of the conferences decide afterwards. They open up in what they call in Portuguese an edital, and then the people of the conference, the different communities, they can submit project proposals for ecological and cultural revitalization projects. And the leadership, indigenous leadership themselves, they decide which projects receive what for supporting this. And these types of things I'm excited about because it's a pure, direct way of creating reciprocity with the non-indigenous world that is looking, even from a global philanthropy point of view. You see so many people, be it in UN spaces or just global philanthropic discussions, talking about indigenous peoples and local communities. Everyone wants to take pictures with them. Everyone loves them. But when you're actually there, you just see that the needs are so high, and what ends up getting there at the local level are just drops in what's seemingly an ocean of funds. And so that's, I think, there's interesting work to be done and knots to be tangled in that. And I think the more we connect and work and collaborate with indigenous leadership on the ground, the more good things can happen, and they just have to happen. It's hard to not become a bit doomsy when you look at how urgent all of this is. But again, that makes that the opportunity and the time is so opportune and urgent.
Yeah, I mean, with the establishment of the Council of the Spiritual Leaders, now there's a centralized place where people can go and offer support, right? Because all the effort that, in terms of a fund, it starts from there, and then we can then direct people towards. As it is right now, even before the conference, for me is okay. Great, there's 1,000 directions. And who do we ask for permission and approval, and who do we work with? That's a real question that I had. But now there's a central place, there's a fund, we can lend our support there. That's beautiful. I want to ask you a question about because you changed your career multiple times from law to the UN, fighting for human rights, now fighting for the sovereignty of indigenous people, especially in the Amazon jungle, right? So that's effectively what I know of you. And there are those who are inspired by this path of the noble warrior, effectively stepping into a bigger mission, unsure where to start. Knowing what you know today, I know you're still on a journey, so you haven't arrived yet. But knowing what you know today, what's the single most powerful move that people are thinking about joining a mission, joining something that's bigger than themselves that they can make right now?
You're not going to believe it, but I would say drinking ayahuasca. It's been the central, most guiding element in my entire journey. Has been ayahuasca ceremonies. Every time I had deep questions on what to do, how to deal with what I was feeling or thinking, worrying about or doubting about, always have been analyzed and entangled and felt and worked through during ayahuasca ceremonies. So it's been the single most guiding element in my entire journey. So I don't want to be a propagator for ayahuasca use, but for I think for those who feel really called by its spirit and by the energy of its love and light and healing, I think if you educate yourself and do that in a humble and fully in integrity type of way, you will inevitably and undoubtedly receive so many blessings in return. And it's only one thing, but I think in general, I guess maybe broader, I've also found a lot of solace and guidance in just meditation itself. It doesn't have to be with ayahuasca, but I became a fervent reader of doing comparative religious study during my human rights and international law studies. I got really inspired by reading books of biographies of Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, other social change makers that had also spiritual sustenance. I think every person's journey is its own, and you have to find your own way. But there's definitely a series of people and things that you can get inspired by in the process, and it's been a lot for me. And going from arts and music is something I profoundly enjoy as well. I play the accordion now too, and you gotta create different outlets for yourself and find ways of being able to find your own inner silence and ask yourself the really tough questions when the time's there, and also pick up your sword and go to battle when it's needed to, and know when to rest and know when to fight, and find that balance.
Beautiful. Hey, Ben, let me just take a moment to acknowledge you. Thank you for who you are, first and foremost. You're definitely someone who has the heart of a warrior, right? Who, is started at 16, drinking ayahuasca, but more importantly, dedicated your life for human rights. And your passion, as quiet as it may be, is palpable. So thank you for just your continued dedication to do this type of work. And thank you for being here on Noble Warrior and share your life story.
Thank you, man. I'm incredibly inspired also by the work you're doing, the things you're trying to get out to the world. And I hope with your podcast and everything that you're doing as a personal trainer and all the tools that you develop. And I know it comes from a really good place from what I've been able to learn from you in our friendship as well. And I admire your leadership and your stance in the world as well, what you stand for and how you carry yourself. And I'm just very pleased with this opportunity to have my first podcast. You popped my cherry. And yeah.
Many more to come. Many more to come.